Claire Thompson pushed open the creaking iron gate that led to the university's dimly lit archives. The room was filled with the scent of old paper and dust, a sanctuary for those who, like her, craved the secrets hidden in the past. She was on a mission. Months of research had led her to an obscure diary, mentioned in passing by a retired professor. The diary supposedly belonged to one of the last residents of Willow Creek, a village that had vanished from local memory nearly a century ago. "Are you sure about this?" Daniel's voice broke the silence as he walked in behind her. Daniel, her and an avid photographer, wore his usual look of cautious amusement. The idea of venturing into the unknown excited him, but he always had one foot in the realm of reality. "I am," Claire said, her eyes gleaming with anticipation as she spotted the diary on a high shelf. She stretched to reach it, the leather-bound cover cracking slightly as she opened it to the first page. The handwriting was jagged and urgent, as if the author had written in haste. One phrase stood out: "The Watcher sees all. We bound him once, but his gaze lingers still." Daniel peered over her shoulder, his brow furrowed. "What exactly is the Watcher?" "Something I'm going to find out," Claire whispered, flipping through the pages, each filled with fragmented memories, warnings, and cryptic references to rituals performed in the village's church to keep an unknown force at bay. 2 weeks later, Claire and Daniel stood at the edge of Black Hollow Forest, accompanied by Megan, a folklore expert with a fascination for arcane rituals, and Tom, an engineer who prided himself on debunking supernatural claims. The air was sharp with the crispness of late autumn, the forest blanketed in golden leaves that crunched underfoot. The path that led to Willow Creek was nearly invisible, reclaimed by decades of neglect and thick foliage. "You're sure it's through here?" Megan asked, her eyes scanning the towering trees that seemed to close in on them like guardians of a secret. "Yes, the map from the diary matches the old survey charts," Claire confirmed, pulling her scarf tighter around her neck as a chill breeze rustled the branches overhead. Tom sighed but gave a small nod, ready to proceed, though his expression showed he was doing this more out of loyalty than belief. The deeper they ventured into the forest, the more the light seemed to fade. The sun, once bright overhead, struggled to penetrate the dense canopy. The occasional bird call or rustle of leaves fell away until silence enveloped them like a blanket. Claire felt the weight of the forest, an oppressive stillness that hinted at something more. They passed an ancient oak tree with a symbol carved into its trunk, a spiral with jagged lines radiating outward. Megan paused, running her fingers over the grooves. "It's a ward," she said, her voice hushed. "It's meant to keep something aware. Maybe keep something in." And Daniel raised his camera and snapped a photo, the flash momentarily casting stark shadows. Tom rolled his eyes, more like the doodles of a bored traveler. They pressed on until, after what felt like hours, the forest gave way to an open clearing. Before them stood the ruins of Willow Creek, half swallowed by time and nature. Stone cottages leaned at odd angles, their roofs caved in, ivy crawling up their crumbling walls. The air was thick, heavy with the scent of wet earth and something metallic that made Claire's skin prickle. At the heart of the village stood the church. Its spire, though cracked and leaning, was still intact. The large wooden door, weathered but resolute, seemed to guard whatever lay inside. Claire felt her pulse quicken as they approached. She pushed the door open, and the hinges groaned as though protesting their intrusion. The interior was dark, dust motes dancing in the beams of light filtering through the cracked, stained glass. The pews were upturned, some broken, and the altar was carved from dark stone, adorned with the same spiral symbol they had seen on the tree. Megan moved to the wall, where more symbols had been etched, faded but unmistakable. "These are protection sigils, but they're layered," she said. "It's as if they were reinforcing them over time, making them stronger." Daniel began taking pictures, his camera clicking methodically. But as he aimed the lens toward the back of the room, something caught his eye. A shadow shifted, darker than the surrounding gloom, and moved as if watching them. "Did anyone else see that?" he asked, his voice tight. Claire turned, following his gaze, but saw nothing. The first whisper was so faint that she thought she had imagined it. Then it came again, clearer this time, a low, urgent sound, like dozens of voices speaking at once. The temperature in the room dropped suddenly, and Claire's breath misted in front of her. "We need to get out of here," Tom said, breaking the silence. But before they could react, the door slammed shut with a force that sent a shudder through the entire building. The whispers grew louder, becoming a chorus of voices that seemed to resonate from the very walls. Daniel's camera flickered and shut off, the lens retracting, as if unwilling to capture whatever horror lay before them. Megan's flashlight flickered, casting jagged beams of light that made the shadows seem to move. Claire's heart raced as she stepped toward the altar. The carved spiral glowed faintly now, as if responding to the voices. One voice rose above the rest, distinct and chilling. "The Watcher sees. The Watcher waits." Before she could process the words, the church erupted in chaos. The chaos inside the church was immediate and overwhelming. The whispers intensified, overlapping into a cacophony of voices, some pleading, some angry, and others filled with a cold, mocking laughter. The carved spiral on the altar glowed with an otherworldly light, casting sharp, angular shadows that slithered across the walls. "Claire, move away from the altar," Tom shouted, his voice shaking but loud enough to cut through the noise. He lunged toward her, grabbing her arm just as the floor beneath the altar cracked with a deep, guttural sound that seemed to come from the earth itself. Claire stumbled backward, eyes wide with terror, as the carved spiral pulsed like a heartbeat, the glow intensifying with each beat. Daniel's camera, now useless, dangled from his neck as he turned to face the shadow that had caught his eye moments before. It was there again, shifting in the dark, coalescing into a figure that seemed to absorb the very light around it. The figure was tall, impossibly so, with limbs elongated and bent at unnatural angles. Its eyes were the most unsettling, dull, sickly yellow that seemed to pierce right through him. Megan dropped her flashlight, and it rolled across the floor, casting spinning beams of light that only made the scene more disorienting. She backed up against the wall, muttering under her breath, "This isn't happening. This isn't real." But it was real. The room grew colder, frost forming on the stone walls and creeping across the cracked wooden pews. The air was heavy with a metallic temps, sharp and biting. Claire felt it in her chest, a suffocating weight that made it hard to breathe. She locked eyes with Megan, who was pale and trembling, her usual composure shattered. "We need to break the circle," Megan whispered, her eyes darting to the glowing spiral on the altar. It's a seal. It's what's keeping the Watcher contained. Before Claire could respond, the figure moved, its body bending and twisting with an unnatural fluidity. It advanced slowly, its elongated fingers scraping against the stone floor, leaving deep gouges as it came closer. The voices shifted, becoming more urgent, almost panicked, as if they, too, were afraid. "Back to the altar," Claire said, finding her voice and grabbing Daniel's arm. "We need to break the seal." Tom, wide-eyed but resolute, nodded and moved toward the altar. The four of them gathered around, the glow of the spiral casting a sickly light on their faces. Claire reached out, her hand trembling, and touched the center of the spiral. It was cold to the touch, colder than the frost that now covered the room. Suddenly, the voices stopped, and a deep silence fell over the church. The shadow figure halted, its glowing eyes narrowing as if sensing their intent. The moment stretched on, each second feeling like an eternity. Then, with a burst of light so intense it made them all cry out. The spiral shattered beneath Claire's fingers, sending a shockwave through the room. The figure shrieked, a sound so piercing it rattled their bones. It recoiled, its limbs flailing as it was pulled backward toward the dark corners of the church. The frost began to melt, water dripping from the walls as warmth returned to the air. The whispers receded, fading into the silence, and the heavy door creaked open as if some unseen force had released it. For a moment, none of them moved, each frozen in place, trying to comprehend what had just happened. Claire's heart pounded in her chest, each beat echoing in her ears. Megan was the first to break the silence, sinking to her knees and letting out a shaky breath. Is it over?" Daniel shook his head, eyes wide as he looked around the now silent church. "I don't think so. I think we just woke something up." The group exited the church, stumbling into the clearing as the last rays of sunlight bled into the darkening sky. The temperature outside was warmer, almost comforting compared to the icy cold of the church. But an unnatural stillness hung over Willow Creek, as if the village itself was holding its breath. "We need to leave," Tom said, running a hand through his hair, which was damp with sweat despite the chill. "We shouldn't have come here." Claire turned to him, eyes fierce, despite the fear still coursing through her veins. "We can't leave. Not yet. We have to understand what this place is, what we just set free." Megan shivered, glancing back at the church. The shadow figure was gone, but the sense of being watched had not faded. The diary mentioned a ritual. If we don't complete it, the Watcher won't just be bound to this village. It could spread. Daniel looked at Claire, a mix of disbelief and determination in his eyes. "Then we finish what we started. But we need more than what we have now." Claire nodded, scanning the ruins. The sun had set completely, and the village was cloaked in the deep, suffocating black of night. She pointed toward a large house at the end of the main path, its stone facade crumbling but still standing. That must have been the head villager's house. If there's anywhere we'll find answers, it's there. The house loomed over them as they approached, its windows shattered and dark. Ivy wound its way up the walls, and the front door hung on one hinge, creaking as the wind nudged it. Inside, the air was heavy with dust, the floorboards groaning under their weight. A fireplace dominated the main room, above which hung a painting, cracked and faded, of a man with stern eyes and a grim set to his mouth. Megan's flashlight swept across the room, landing on a desk cluttered with papers and books. Claire rifled through them, her heart leaping when she found a journal bound in leather, its cover marked with the spiral symbol. "This has to be it," she said, opening it to the first page. The handwriting was neat and deliberate, detailing daily life in Willow Creek and the gradual descent into fear. One passage stood out, dated just days before the village was abandoned. "We tried to bind him with light, but he is clever, watching from the dark places. The wards hold for now, but I fear they will not last. If he breaks free, he will not stay bound to this cursed place." A sudden noise from the back of the house made them all freeze up. Soft scraping, like something being dragged across the floor. Tom shone his flashlight in the direction of the sound, the beam catching the edge of a broken mirror. A reflection stared back at them, but it wasn't their own. The reflection in the shattered mirror seemed to pulse with a life of its own, eyes wide and filled with something between terror and warning. It flickered like a flame before disappearing altogether, leaving only their pale, wide-eyed reflections staring back at them. A chill swept through the room, making the hairs on the back of Claire's neck stand up. "We need to keep moving," she said, her voice shaking but firm. She flipped through the journal quickly, her fingers smudging the fragile ink. The entries became more erratic as the pages went on, detailing strange rituals, the creation of protective wards, and the figure known only as the Watcher. One passage was circled repeatedly, the ink blotchy from what looked like tears. "The altar binds him, but the light must come from within." "What does that mean?" Daniel asked, peering over her shoulder. His voice was hoarse, and he glanced nervously at the mirror, which now reflected only the dim room. "It means we're missing something," Claire replied, closing the journal and shoving it into her backpack. "There's another part of this ritual, something we have to find." A sudden thud came from upstairs, and the wooden ceiling creaked as if under the weight of something heavy moving. They exchanged quick, panicked glances before Claire nodded toward the staircase. "We need to check it out. If there's anything left in this house that can help us, it'll be up there." Tom swallowed hard, gripping his flashlight like a weapon. "This is madness, but we're in too deep now." They ascended the stairs slowly, each step groaning under their combined weight. The second floor was darker than the first, the broken windows covered by ivy and old, heavy drapes. A long hallway stretched before them, lined with doors that were either ajar or off their hinges. At the far end of the hallway, a room glowed faintly, as if lit by a candle. The others hesitated, but Claire moved forward, drawn by the soft light. The room was a study, filled with dusty books and a large, mahogany desk. On the desk sat an old oil lamp, flickering despite the lack of fuel. Next to it was a small, ornate box carved with symbols similar to the spiral on the altar. Megan stepped forward, her eyes wide. "This is it. This must be what they used in the rituals." Claire reached for the box, but before her fingers touched it, the room shifted. A sudden wind howled through the open windows, papers swirling in the air as the lamp's flame turned blue. A deep, rumbling growl echoed around them, and the temperature plummeted. From the dark corners of the room, the shadow appeared again, but this time it was closer, its shape more defined. It had a gaunt face, eyes glowing with an unnatural yellow light, and limbs that moved like smoke. "Take the box, Claire," Daniel yelled, snapping her out of her trance. She grabbed the box, the wood cold and heavy in her hands. The shadow let out a bone-chilling shriek and lunged toward them, its form stretching and shifting as it moved. "Downstairs, go," Tom shouted, pushing Megan forward as they bolted down the hallway, the shadow pursuing them with a speed that defied its amorphous form. They stumbled down the staircase, the noise of their footsteps drowned out by the unearthly sound of the entity's wail. They burst into the main room, and Claire slammed the box onto the altar, fingers fumbling with the latch. Inside was a small shard of crystal, glowing with a faint, white light. The moment she touched it, warmth spread through her arm, chasing away the bone-deep chill. The shadow hesitated at the foot of the stairs, as if repelled by the light of the crystal. It hissed, eyes narrowing with something that looked like recognition or fear. Megan stepped forward, her voice steady despite the tremble in her hands. "Claire, the journal said the light must come from within. You need to use it." Claire nodded, holding the shard tightly as she stepped closer to the altar. The shadow shrieked again, a sound so filled with rage and pain that it rattled the walls. But it did not move forward, held back by the light that now pulsed from the shard. Claire took a deep breath and placed the shard into the center of the spiral, pressing it into the carved lines. The entire altar lit up, the light spreading like liquid fire through the carvings on the walls and floor. The warmth grew into a searing heat, and for a moment, Claire felt as if her entire body was glowing. The shadow let out one final, piercing scream as it was pulled backward, its form dissipating into the dark corners of the room. The light flared brightly, blinding them all, before dimming into a soft, steady glow. The silence that followed was almost deafening. Tom sank to the floor, gasping for air, while Daniel wrapped his arm around Claire, pulling her close. Megan wiped a tear from her cheek, staring at the now dormant altar. The glow from the shard remained, a gentle, pulsing light that seemed to hold the darkness at bay. "It's over," Megan whispered, though her voice carried an edge of doubt. Claire looked at the others, her face pale but resolute. For now, they left the house as dawn broke, the first rays of sunlight casting the village in a soft, forgiving light. The oppressive chill had lifted, replaced by a stillness that felt almost peaceful. But the memory of what they had faced lingered in the silence. As they stepped back into the forest, Claire turned one last time to look at Willow Creek. For a moment, she thought she saw a figure in the window of the church, a shadow with glowing eyes. But when she blinked, it was gone. They walked in silence, each lost in their thoughts, the weight of their discovery pressing down on them. Claire knew this story would be more than just another chapter in her book. It was a warning, a reminder that some places are forgotten for a reason, and some secrets are meant to stay buried. But deep in the ruins of Willow Creek, the soft glow of the crystal shard continued to pulse, as if keeping watch. And somewhere, in the unseen spaces between shadows, something watched back. The journey back to Black Hollow was silent, each member of the group too lost in their own thoughts to speak. The once formidable forest seemed less threatening in the early morning light. But the memory of the Watcher and the darkness that had filled the village lingered like a cold shadow. When they arrived at Claire's apartment, exhaustion settled over them. heavy and suffocating. The adrenaline that had propelled them through the night wore off, leaving only the raw realization of what they had seen. Daniel brewed a pot of strong coffee, the rich aroma doing little to soothe their frayed nerves. Megan broke the silence, sitting cross-legged on the floor, the journal open in her lap. "This isn't over," she said, her eyes scanning the last pages. The diary talked about binding the Watcher, but there was more, something about cycles and rebirth. Tom looked up, dark circles under his eyes. "What are you saying? That it can come back?" Megan nodded solemnly. "Yes, and not just in Willow Creek. If it's been freed, its reach could grow beyond that place." Claire rubbed her temples, the throb of a headache threatening to break through. "We need to know more. We need to understand what the Watcher is, why the villagers worshipped and feared it, and what can permanently stop it." Daniel sat down beside her, placing a comforting hand on her back. "We have the journal, the crystal shard, and the pictures. It's a start." They spent the next few days poring over the journal and historical texts Claire had collected, trying to piece together the mystery. The journal's author, whose identity they discovered to be Father Elias Grayson, the village's priest, had chronicled the rituals, the sacrifices, and the villagers' desperate attempts to appease the Watcher. The creature was older than the village itself, an ancient spirit bound to the land, feeding on fear and darkness. One entry stood out to Claire as she read it aloud. "The light of the shard is but a temporary prison. It requires a keeper one to bear its burden and ensure the darkness does not seep into the world again." A shiver ran down her spine. The shard pulsed faintly on the table between them, the soft light casting shadows across their tired faces. "What does that mean?" Tom asked, looking between Claire and Megan. Megan's expression darkened. "It means someone has to guard it, keep it safe, or it will lose its power and the Watcher will return." The realization weighed heavily on them. They knew someone would need to take responsibility for the crystal shard, dedicating themselves to ensuring the Watcher stayed imprisoned. The decision could not be taken lightly, as the diary hinted that the bond between the Keeper and the shard was deeper than they understood. Days turned into weeks as they debated and researched, trying to find another way. During this time, strange occurrences began to follow them. Daniel's photographs developed with dark shapes that hadn't been there before, shadowy figures with glowing eyes, peering from corners and doorways. Megan felt a cold presence in her apartment at night, whispers seeping into her dreams and waking her with a start. Tom, the skeptic who had once dismissed the supernatural, now carried an unease that he couldn't shake. One evening, Claire sat alone in her office, staring at the crystal shard. It glowed faintly, as if aware of her gaze. She felt a pull, a connection that she couldn't explain. The room grew colder, and she heard the faintest of whispers. "Keeper." A knock at the door snapped her out of the trance. Daniel stood there, worry etched into his features. "We need to talk," he said, glancing at the shard. "I don't think we're safe, even here." Before she could respond, a crash echoed from the living room. They rushed out to find Megan standing in the center of the room, eyes wide with fear. The window had shattered inward, shards of glass scattered across the floor. A cold wind blew in, carrying the unmistakable metallic scent from Willow Creek. "It's here," Megan whispered, clutching her arms as if trying to fend off an unseen chill. It's trying to break free. The realization hit them all at once. The Watcher was not fully imprisoned. It was fighting against the bonds of the shard, testing the limits of its prison. Claire grabbed the journal and flipped to the last, heavily smudged page. The writing was frantic. If the prison falters, the keeper must renew the bond with their own light, or the dark will consume them all. Tom took a step forward, the panic in his eyes replaced with a grim resolve. Claire, you're the one. The journal's warnings, the connection you feel to the shard it's you. Daniel's face fell. No, there has to be another way. We can't ask her to. I have to, Claire interrupted, her voice steady. If I don't, it will find a way out. And we all know what that means. They prepared for the ritual that night, following the instructions they had pieced together from the journal. Candles were lit, forming a protective circle around Claire and the altar where the shard lay. Megan recited the incantations, her voice firm despite the tremble in her hands. The room grew colder, the air so thick it felt like a weight pressing on their chests. The glow from the shard intensified, and a shadow appeared, darker and more menacing than ever before. It circled just outside the candlelight, eyes glistening with rage. Claire closed her eyes, focusing on the warmth that the shard radiated. She whispered the words from the journal, feeling them resonate deep within her. The shard pulsed, each beat matching her own heartbeat until they were one. Light erupted from the shard, filling the room and driving back the shadows. The whispers turned to a scream, a sound so unearthly that it made their bones vibrate. When the light faded, Claire slumped forward, exhaustion pulling her into unconsciousness. The room was silent, the shard's light steady and calm. The Watcher was gone, bound once more by the ritual and Claire's own light. When Claire awoke, she was in her apartment, the early morning light filtering through the window. Daniel sat beside her, relief flooding his eyes when he saw she was awake. You did it, he whispered. It's over. Claire sat up slowly, the weight of the shard now a permanent part of her. She could feel its presence within her, a subtle pulse that reminded her of her new role as its keeper. The village of Willow Creek remained silent, but the memory of the Watcher lingered, a silent reminder that some darknesses could only be contained, never destroyed. The story of Willow Creek was far from over, but for now, there was peace. And Claire, now bound to the light that kept the shadows at bay, knew she would do whatever it took to ensure that peace endured.